In today's video, we want to discuss the variation of hammers and dollies, why you may pick one versus another, and why what you don't know may hurt you more than make your panel look better. I want to take you guys back to June of 21, so 3 years almost to the date as to when we're filming this, and make you understand that sometimes metal finishing or doing a higher quality of metalwork is within your reach, and I don't want you to think that it's unobtainable. The reason that I am telling you this story is because back 3 years ago, the only dolly that I had was this, what looks like a half chewed up hockey puck and a damaged hammer. This wasn't the exact hammer, but there's some issues with these things. And I really want to relate to you guys because you're in your garage most likely, or you work for a shop and you're trying to produce the best car that you can. We don't get into cars as just a whatever, at least in my opinion. For me, cars was a passion. I wanted to build the nicest car that I could build, even if that was in my garage. So I want to give you guys and unlock some of the secrets that I have learned through classes and educating myself to help you guys in your garage understand what goes into a hammer and a dolly. And as simple as it may sound, there is a lot of things and reasons as to why that I picked one or the other. I chose in June 3 years ago to take Ken Sakamoto's class in Pasadena, California. If you guys don't know who he is, in my opinion, he is the Chip Foose, the Jesse James of metal finishing. I look up to him very highly in what he does, and we don't want to discredit his class because he does a hands-on class showing you how to do this stuff. But really, I want to just drive it home that there's a lot more than what meets the eye on metal finishing. There's a lot of little tiny things that if you go to do this in your garage, some people may be able to pull that off. And some people might need to be criticized because they don't understand that way that they're doing. You might hear it a certain way, but when you actually go to do it, you think you're doing it that way, but you're just not. There's a lot of technique and finesse that goes into this. And if you guys want to take your metal finishing to the next level, I cannot recommend Ken enough. He's a good friend of mine. But today, we're gonna get into the specifics of hammers and dollies. We're gonna go through these hammers like they're golf clubs because everybody's gonna do things a little differently. I'm no golf expert. But if we start with our driver is going to be the high crown hammer. What do you do with a driver? You're hitting the ball far. A high crown hammer, you're going to be moving a lot of metal versus creeping in on something and getting a very low crown panel straight. This is going to be used for your cars like the 40s fenders, big shaped panels that have a lot of stretch in them already. A cross peen that's on the backside is just going to be used to get into a body line or a 90-degree area that maybe has a crease, dented, damage, and you can force it back out with the cross peen. Now you've teed off, and if you play golf like I do, you hit that ball straight into a sand trap. And at this point, you're going to need a specialty golf club to get you back out of it. So the sand wedge that's going to get you out of that hole is something that we're being very specific about on how we're going to move it. If you're stuck in a sand hole and you've got to get down under the ball and out, we're being specific about where we're moving the ball. You're being very specific about where you are moving the metal. If we think about the metal being water and you struck this hammer into the water, that water is going to move in two different directions. Where would you use a linear stretching hammer? A linear stretching hammer is typically used to stretch out a panel. So if you think about a kick stretcher, where you're stretching the metal out to make a flanged out area. Maybe you are gapping a car and you just welded the edge of the door. Well, what happens in the past videos that we've shown when you guys weld, it shrinks. And when it shrinks, the panel of the door dives inward. If you use a linear stretching hammer and a toe dolly, you can smack that and it will actually stretch the edge of the door back out flush and you can move on down the car. Now, maybe you're a better golfer than I am and you're not always going to need the sand wedge. You're not always going to need a linear stretching hammer. This is not a necessity. It's just a specialty hammer that sometimes gets you out of a pinch. All right, you've gotten yourself out of the sand trap. Now we're back on the green. We're gonna get a little bit closer to the hole, and we're gonna use the 9-iron. The slapper is our 9-iron. That slapper needs to be dead flat. This slapper is really used to just dial you in and get you closer to where you want to be. What this is great for is that if you have a low area, when you strike this onto the dolly, you are bridging your areas that are already high, and you are dialing your metal in versus like a hammer that's going to pinpoint one small section. Here you have the ability to strike two areas that are already close to the shape that you're working on, and it's going to dial you in and get you closer to that finish that you're looking for. What these are typically made out of is anything from a leaf spring, because maybe they're a little wider, they're heavy. This one is a slapping file, which some people think the slapping file or the file in general is going to shrink metal. It doesn't work that way. We just took the belt sander and we polished it up and we ground it all dead flat, and now you can use this as another specialty tool to get you closer to flat. You got that 9-iron out, you're closer to the hole, we're 10 feet from getting it in. We're gonna grab the putter. The putter, we're gonna refer to a low crown hammer as the putter. Putter is going to be a very low crown radius. This low crown radius is going to be used on something like a Lincoln, something that has a very flat panel and you don't wanna move it far. If you're using a high crown hammer, we're back at the driver, we're moving metal far. Where here, we can dial back and we can use something that is not dead flat. It just has a very low crown. You're gonna match that with very low, flatter panels. We don't wanna move it a bunch. And in this back here is just another cross peen, a very small one for getting into tighter areas. Maybe you have a very tiny ding in a groove and you just need to work it out. This hammer is used on the miniature golf course with your first girlfriend in high school. That's about it. You don't want to use this hammer. This is where I was 3 years ago. Loose handle, flat surfaces on both ends. This hammer has no crown to it at all whatsoever. And I don't recommend these. These are going to cause way more damage. You don't have any accuracy if the handle's about to fall off, and you're going to end up stretching a bunch of these square marks and round marks into your panel, causing more damage than you started with. And today we really want to show you guys how to fix all these things, even if it's a cheap hammer. This hammer is not necessarily an expensive one. All the Hammer and Dollys that I use are Martin Brothers, but this was just a cheap one that we used as a demonstration in our classes. If you guys are wanting to know more about our classes, go to sylvesterscustoms.com, where we go over all of these tips and tricks on how to get your restoration to a very high level and not have any of the headaches. Don't be a miniature golfer. Now let's talk about the dollies. Unrelated to golf, we have a bunch of different shapes, and the goal here is that you are picking a dolly that is matching the shape of your panel. So I'm going to use the Lincoln as an example. We have a very low crown, a very flat panel. We have a very low radius to this dolly. It doesn't have a ton of shape. Versus if we compare some of these other dollies that have a huge crown and a ton of shape, we are going to balloon something out way more than what it is. So if this is the only dolly that you have, like I had a flat surface, one side was kind of sort of round, and really it's only in one direction or two directions. It's not even round both ways. So this dolly was always hurting me when I was trying to move metal. So I want you guys to understand why you need to pick one shape versus another. Now, this dolly is good because one side of it has a very low crown and one side of it has a very high crown. It has a lot of mass to it, so it's going to stay a lot more rigid when you're trying to move metal. Now, the reason that we have sharp edges is really just to crispen up an edge that you have. Maybe it's a body line. You're going to place that in there and ever so carefully be precision with your hammers and dollies. More importantly, if you think about metal as you move it as clay or pizza dough, I always talk about, when you're smashing it with a hammer, you need to match up a couple things with one another. If you have a specific dolly that you're using on your panel, I want you guys to understand what hammer goes with a certain dolly and what ones don't. If we're trying to just get the panel in alignment, so if we think about the sweep of the panel, the curvature of a panel, and it's a low crown panel, it's not necessarily something that has a lot of shape in it, a lot of strength, it's going to move a lot easier. And not to say that you can't do that with the ones that have a lot of shape, but bumping is a very easy technique to get things a lot closer. Now, assessing the panel, if the panel has a ton of stretch and damage and it's all crunched, you got to work that damage out. And doesn't matter if it's excessive damage or if it's a panel that just has a bunch of lows. So let's just say you take blue Dykem layout fluid and you put it on the side of your car, and if you sanded it, you only had a couple areas touching. You don't want to dive into these bigger areas of what I call just the dark hole. You have only a couple high points showing. You need to get it to where things are actually tracking pretty good for that curvature. So bumping in that way, a toe dolly works great because it's a low crown and you can just go in there and bump the metal. We're not even using a hammer at that point. And if you bump it and take the block and go over the sandpaper, over the Dykem, it's going to show you when those points of contact come in and start becoming more uniform. Now you can then pick your slapper and start tying those low areas in. Well, what are you doing? You're taking that pizza dough, that metal, that clay, and you're smashing it. Anytime you are making contact hammer on dolly, it is displacing that metal and it is growing in the direction of the crown. The crown that is more crowned than the other side. And what do I mean by that? If you have a low crown hammer and you have a toe dolly and you compare the two, whatever one has more crown, the metal is going to go in that direction. And the reason that I bring that up is we have had discussions with friends and other people that have taken the class, and we've struggled, myself included, and then we sit back and we talk about why that is. So if I grab a high crown hammer and the toe dolly, if this crowned hammer was more curvature than this crown here, you're going to be trying to think about this as working the metal upward over the dolly. If you have a low, it's actually going to go the opposite direction and you end up stretching the metal. You can hear you're getting hammer on dolly. You know you're stretching it, but it's not stretching in the right direction and you're becoming this bigger crater. Well, that's because the bigger the crown wins. It doesn't matter if it's on the dolly side or the hammer side. You need to be very specific. So what you want to do is once you have bumped the panel into alignment, you've scuffed it and you start seeing more points connecting, you're going to be then using a slapper on the dolly, matching the dolly with the shape of the car and slapping it. If you get the points of contact closer together, you are now bridging those points of contact and you are stretching only the areas that are low. So if you spray the blue Dykem fluid, I want you guys to fully understand, you are putting this dolly on the area that needs to come up, on the low, and you are actually hitting the area in the low, watching it stretch upward, and then as you block with every couple hits, you can start to see that come into shape. When it comes to the last few little tiny areas of blue that you need to pinpoint, you are then at the end of the hole at the golfing range and you're just trying to get it into the hole. Now you're going to be using a low crown hammer so you can creep up on that shape. We're still using the same dolly to match the shape, but remember, we're using a hammer that's going to be precise because now we are pinpointing one little area. The problem is, if you pick a hammer that you're over there on the miniature golf course, that miniature golf course hammer that's dead flat is going to be hitting all the way on that entire surface, and it's going to be putting rings in that panel, and you're never really getting the dent out. You're just causing more damage. You're putting more stretch everywhere that thing is hitting, where a hammer that has a very slight crown in it, now you're only hitting at one little tiny spot instead of the whole face of the hammer hitting and displaced. I want to show you guys today how to correct the dollies. These dollies are brand new Martin Brothers dollies, and at first glance, before we put the blue Dicom fluid over this dolly looked really good. It was polished up. It didn't appear to have any flaws. And then the other thing is, I want you guys to see how to correct a hammer that's flat. Maybe your budget doesn't account for spending the money on a nice quality set of hammers. How do you go to a yard sale, a swap meet, and pick up a hammer that's at least not loose, or correct the handle? Maybe you replace the handle, but how do you correct the face? I want to show you guys step by step on how to perfect all of your hammers and all of your dollies. To start correcting your dollies, number one, how good is your dolly? Maybe it's good out of the gate, but 9 times out of 10 they're usually not. We're going to be using Dicom blue layout fluid. You just spray this. This is acting as your guide coat. That guide coat is then going to be visible when you take a acrylic block. You can use whatever you want to use. What I'm using is a next level block. These particular blocks are used for details. What they have is a very fine, this is like, I think, a 1/16 of the acrylic, and it has some flexibility. I need that flexibility so that way it will curve over the block itself, and I can see what that radius of the dolly or the hammer needs to be. What I'm going to be doing to do that, to correct it, is I'm going to be using 80 grit. Now, I'm putting 80 grit on the block, but that's not necessarily how I'm going to take down those highs. I need to get this thing nice and smooth for that very low crown. This dolly is really cool because it has a lot of very different shapes and a lot of sharp edges and very interesting things. You never know when you're going to need those specific shapes on your car, so this is a really handy one to have. But what we're going to do is we're going to take the block and just lightly scuff, and what it's going to do is going to hit and ride on all of the highs so we can see where those lows are. But more importantly, we need to cut those back nice and smooth. And the reason that I bring this up is 80 grit, if you think about this as like you're doing body filler, we don't put body filler on a car. If you go back to all of our videos on body filler, we don't go to 220 grit or 120 grit. We cut that down. If you have a mountain range, you don't want to cut it down with a little shovel. You'll be there all day long and it'll never be flat. We want to come in and we want to level that ground. We want to use 80 grit on a belt sander or a DA. A DA, you're going to take that and you're going to be evenly moving across that dolly to then wear it flat. The 80 grit and that motion is what's going to wear that dolly, the high points, down and be smooth. At that point, you can start seeing the Dicom go away. Any of those areas, the whole thing here is that you're moving in a nice fluid motion so you get a very nice sweep across the dolly. Same thing that goes for the belt sander. We are going to be using a Ameribraid belt sander today, and then we're going to be moving this through, but you can totally use a cheap Harbor Freight belt sander if you want to. That's what Ken teaches in his class, is just a bunch of cheap belt sanders, and they work great. But I want to dive into the specifics of what we're looking for on the belt sander, as well as what grits that we're going to step this up to, because we want this dolly to be a mirror finish and look like a piece of chrome. Because if you just sanded it with 80 grit, the finish is going to transfer onto your sheet metal. So if your hammers look really dinged up, your dollies look dinged up, and they're uneven, they're not going to they're going to transfer exactly what your dollies look like. This is our Ameribraid belt sander. This thing does a ton of different functions. If you guys have not looked into Ameribraid, this is not a plug, they don't sponsor me, but this has been the biggest game changer tool. It does a lot of different things. It kicks to the side, it has several tables that will come in here real easy, and it takes literally seconds to do all these belt swaps and changes. We're going to start with that 80 grit as I was talking about cutting it down. But more importantly, if we have inconsistencies in the dichum and we need to get that thing to a nice good radius, the last thing we're going to do is put it on the belt sander on this flat rigid surface, because what it's going to do is it's going to make it look like a toe dolly. Now if we need something that's dead flat like this toe dolly, then yes, I'm going to be using this hard surface to grind it until I have a very even scratch all the way through the dolly. In this case, I'm going to be using the area of the belt that gives a little bit, and we are going to then move this through ever so lightly, and we're going to be checking our finish. It is going to be an aggressive scratch, and then we're going to show, after we grind down the bulk of it, what we go to next. Make sure you got eye protection. As we take one pass through the belt sander, you can see how fast that 80 grit cuts down those little inconsistencies, and we're getting a nice even scratch up here towards the top, but you can see where you've got to do a little more work and there's an excessive low. If you were to sit there and take this dolly out of the box and try to metal finish something to a mirror, that is not going to allow you to do that. I wonder if the magnet works. Where's that magnet? Oh, here it is. Now that we have everything leveled and nice and flat, we've gone all the way around the surfaces that I want to correct, and the scratches are showing nice and even. What's nice about this particular belt sander, not that you have to have it, is that you can play with the speed and you can change the shape of the dolly if you need to. But really the biggest thing that we want here is just a nice uniform scratch with no lows. At this point, we need to get rid of only the scratch. We're not trying to change the shape of the dolly. We're going to upgrade from 80 grit belt to 120 grit belt, and we are going to do the exact same motions. We're just refining the scratch a little bit more. Now that we have it all to 120 grit, everything is nice and uniform. We're making sure we don't have any 80 grit scratches left. We're now going to upgrade from 120 grit to 220 grit. This is optional. I would say you don't have to do this. It's just one added little touch that I feel like it shines up a little bit better, but I'm putting 600 grit sticky back. You can use 600 grit's not going to be taking a ton of material. It's not like the 80 grit where we're reshaping this dolly. That is still hot. But here we're just trying to refine the scratches, and 600 grit, if you have an interface pad handy, I don't have one on me right at the moment, but here we're just going to take this and we're just going to run over and try to refine a little bit of these scratches from the 220 grit, so that way it polishes out a little easier. I am no expert at polishing. I literally walked in and asked the polisher what to buy, what to use. This, in my opinion, is optional. As you can see, this thing already shines at 600 grit. There's really not a ton of need to do this, but again, it depends. Maybe you're hammer and dollying on aluminum and you want that transfer of that mirror shine. If you look at an English wheel, the better that you can get these things to shine, the better the transfer is. You're gonna have a very shiny, nice looking part. So we wanna take you guys to the full spectrum here. What we're going to be using is, this is made from Zephyr. This is just a Bauer Harbor Freight polisher on their stand. And then the black is a heavy cutting compound. You just want to use that on a more rigid wheel. So these are also Zephyr, and the blue and the yellow are a different firmness. Again, I'm not a polisher, but the yellow is very firm. So I'm going to cut the majority with the black, the heavy cutting compound on the yellow, and then to polish it for the final, I'm going to use the very fine polishing. This is the green on the blue, and you'll see this thing comes out really nice. This is the finished product. It came out really nice. This is as good as you're ever gonna need. It looks like a piece of chrome. All of that is going to directly transfer into your metal. And if you're asking yourself, well, why is this important? It's important when you're trying to do a very high quality car, because if you have different thicknesses of metal, that is why metal finishing is important. What you're doing is accurately moving the metal back to be a mirror reflection. That's the true, real metal finishing. It's not the just get it good enough in a DA. It's get the metal back as good as you can get it. And I don't think this is for necessarily everybody, but if you're wanting to make sure that you don't have a phantom wave is when you put your car in the sun and that metal is expanding and contracting, or you have areas in your panel that are low and high, and you end up with excessive filler. One, people don't want excessive filler. You're just looking to have failures where when filler becomes excessive, it's more prone to crack or blister, and you're just becoming thicker and thicker. If you keep your the mill thickness down to a minimum, you're going to have less failures. You're going to have a better solid foundation. But more importantly, when you put that in the sun, if you have an area in the panel and the panel has a high spot and you just filled that area with filler next to it that's a low spot, you have a different heat sink, a different expansion and contraction rate. Now, do I think your car has to be a perfect mirror? No. But I can tell you that on a low crown panel, say a Lincoln, something that doesn't have a ton of shape, it doesn't have a ton of strength, that metal becomes loose, and if you don't take all the little dings out of it, those low crown panels will then move. You put it in the sun and you don't understand why you have a bad finish on the car. You might have a good finish in the shade, and when you put it out in the sun, those expansion and contraction rates and the heat sink of the filler all play a part in the overall finish of your vehicle. The goal here is that we're trying to show you guys the spectrum of how to keep things to a higher quality and have a better end result. The only thing I want to add is that when it comes to the hammers, you're going to be doing this exact same process, and maybe you just use a DA and round this out to where you get rid of that very fine perimeter. And if you want a low crown hammer, you just keep sanding it to a minimum to where you have a very low radius. If you want a high crown hammer, you can grab a grinder and you can start taking off a lot more material to give that radius more of a crown. And then just go right back through this exact same process with the belt sander and polishing, and your hammers will look like new. You won't have circles and damage, and you're pinpointing exactly where you're moving the metal. If you guys want to know more about the metal finishing process on a panel, don't forget to check out our metal finishing videos where we go step by step. And if you really want to elevate it, look up Ken Sakamoto in Pasadena, California. You will not be disappointed. We'll see you guys on the next one.